Let's talk about trust. Specifically, why building trust is key to maximizing company savings. I visited a potential client not too long ago, and I met with a young man who was assisting me with preparing some paperwork that I needed to prepare in order to onboard with the client. Now, this young man was a very proactive individual. He told me what I needed to do in order to prepare for our meeting. He was very organized. We went into the room. He had a very professional demeanor about himself. We sat down, but then immediately we started to just have a human moment. We started to talk about his life and his daughter. We started to talk about my life and my passions for singing and the other things that were going on in my life. And then the conversation steered in the direction of what we were there to talk about, which was the relationship between his organization and my business. And he asked me, well, tell me a little bit more about your business. And as I began to describe what we do, his ears perked up. And he said, team development. That seems very interesting. There's a lot going on in other areas, but we don't do a lot of team development in this office. And so I paused. I said, well, tell me a little bit more about that. He said that there was a director who had recently left, someone that the employees believed in, they loved, and when they left, the entire environment shifted, and the new director wasn't someone that the people could really buy into. The energy had shifted. People were leaving, it seemed like every month. And we started to talk about the concept of team building and team development. And he said, well, their idea of team building and team development is us all getting together outside in the heat and playing kickball. And we have to do that next week, by the way. And he rolled his eyes and he did not seem too enthusiastic about it, but he seemed like he just wanted to show up because he wanted to be a good team player, but it wasn't having the impact, the genuine impact that the organization, and I'm sure the organization thought that it was going to have everyone come together to play kickball next week. And as I reflected on everything that this young man said, I saw this theme of trust. And I saw the cost of trust. And the cost was so exponential in this particular instance because there were some things that were missed in the building blocks of trust. And so before we start talking about team building, we have to talk about the elements, the building blocks of trust, because that's the foundation of team building. That's the foundation of any relationship. Think about your relationship with your significant other, or think about your relationship with your friends. Trust is at the core of those things. This is why you're able to be vulnerable and able to share your most deepest, darkest secrets. And you're able to go into those spaces and you feel safe and you feel light and you feel free. But how do we get there? See, trust can be defined as the belief in the strength, truth, ability, or reliability of someone or something. You see, in our friendships or romantic relationships, our trust is in someone. And when we examine that trust, we sometimes test their strength to stay around when times get tough. We test their truth and whether or not they're telling us the truth and they're a trustworthy person by what they say. We observe their ability to get things done, the things that we think are important in relationships, and we examine their reliability, their ability to follow through on their word. And so, as leaders, our employees, Our subordinate managers are looking at our strength. They're looking at our truth. They're looking at our ability and our reliability, because that's what they're believing in. And in many instances, they're trusting us with their careers. They're trusting us with their future. They're trusting us to have a vision that's going to steer them in a direction that's in alignment with how they feel, think, and act. But when we don't do that, what happens? What happens when there's an absence of trust? Well, before we get there, there are certain signs, right? Because I always use this term when I'm talking about trusting something. I say trust but verify. I trust that you're a capable individual, but I also have things in place to verify. And that happens in our relationships at every stage of the game, whether or not you're dating, whether or not you're in a relationship, or you decide to get married. Sometimes you say or do things to trust that your partner is still in it with you and is strong enough to weather the storm when it comes. Sometimes you say or do things to see if your partner is going to be truthful. Sometimes you test their ability to accomplish something that you knew you could have done yourself, but you just wanted to see if they're able to take that on. And then reliability. We're testing and we're verifying that they're able to follow through. You said you were going to pick the kids up. Did you do it? But when that trust is broken, when any of those legs are broken, we have to continue to maintain the trust, because it's not just in building the trust, it's also in maintaining the trust. Because when you're new to something, think about the newness of relationships. Everything is beautiful in the beginning, typically. But then there's something that happens somewhere in there, that there was a turn that was taken and we don't know how we got here, but the trust is broken. In some instances, we know how we got there because it was a progressive, slippery slope. We saw one of the legs of trust, one of the elements or building blocks of trust, get taken out of the equation. Perhaps it was truth. And so our reaction may vary. Some individuals, they examine it. They say, I'm going to keep looking, but I'll proceed. Some individuals, they step back and they reframe the entire relationship in their minds. Sometimes they communicate it, sometimes they don't. Some individuals leave altogether. And there is a cost associated with all of these different things. So what does that cost? When we take that same concept and we bring it to business and we bring it to our teams again, they're trusting in our strength as leaders. They're trusting in our truth, our ability, and our reliability. And when either of those things are shaky, some of the individuals, they may see it, observe, and they still push forward because to a degree, they may not necessarily need certain elements of that in order to be able to show up and do what's necessary for the job. However, some individuals, they step back and they reframe the entire relationship and perception of the environment, and they may or may not say anything. And in some instances, that is one of the first indications that productivity starts to slow, because if they can't follow through on their word, why should I? I'll get them the report when I can. I'll process this when I can. Because they're watching us as leaders. They're paying attention to what we're doing and what we're saying. And then some people, they end up leaving altogether. But what's the cost of that? On average, when a person leaves, it costs from 50% up to 2 times of the salary of the individual to replace that individual. And it doesn't stop there because, as they say, one bad apple can spoil the bunch. And people are paying attention because that is their way of trusting, but verifying. So they're observing the colleague who's been there for 10, 20, 30 years and all of a sudden leaves. And they assess, is this a safe environment? What's happening? They start to communicate. And in some instances, it becomes so infectious that your key players start to disappear. And for some leaders in some organizations, that has profound impacts because they haven't done the work of facilitating an environment of trust and also succession planning to guard against those kinds of things. And so it's not only our responsibility as leaders to create and cultivate an environment of trust from the top down, but also to facilitate an environment of trust among peers, because sometimes they can't figure out how to bridge the gap. And when they can't figure out how to bridge the gap, when we don't as leaders fill that gap for them, sometimes they'll fill it themselves. And when they fill it themselves, what they come up with is their best option is to leave. And ultimately, that impacts the morale of the team, that impacts the bottom line of the organization. And typically, it's a lose-lose situation. So why not, while you can, as a leader, focus on trust, focus on your foundation, focus on not only the top down, but also the horizontal trust that needs to be built and cultivated in order to have a strong organization and a strong team. Because that foundation will set the stage for the future of your organization and for the future of your success and the success of the people who you're leading. So with that, I hope that this was helpful. I hope that you treat trust as a focus point, not just something to be done once a year, but a continuous pursuit.